Hey Neal, how are you doing today? It's Michael from Measured Golf. We had the pleasure of meeting yesterday at the Ohio State University while we were working with the women's team, and it was really nice getting to watch you hit a few golf shots and kind of hang out and kind of pick your brain a little bit. So thanks so much for taking the time and sharing some of your information with me. It was really cool. And then as a nice little bonus, we were able to sneak you in and get you in on the plates, which I know that you were kind of interested in and kind of what we do. So without further ado, man, I think we're going to jump right into it. We're going to kind of start with looking at this iron swing. And I know that there's a lot of information on the screen right now. And my job is to kind of take all this information and kind of make it actionable and simple for you as an athlete. So, what we're going to try to do is we're going to take all this information and I'm going to do my best to kind of translate what I see. And hopefully, you're kind of nodding your head along as I do that. And it kind of more or less sums up what you do. And then I think we can talk about maybe one or two things that we could clean up that might change some of those things if those are things that you think warrant change. Because just because we change graphs on a force plate doesn't mean that we make you a better golfer. And the number one thing you always have to remember, Neal, is you're a great golfer. That's why you had the incredible finish at the 2023 USAM, finishing second is a hell of a performance. But we just got to keep grinding and keep getting better. And I definitely think the cool thing that I see here is that there's some opportunity maybe for you to even get a little bit better and be able to really take that next step and dive into the tour and go out there and give them hell. So, without further ado, let's take a look at this golf swing, man. So, obviously, you're a real nice player. This is with the 7 iron. I'm just going to let it play through so you can kind of see, make sure it looks like you swinging the golf club and all that fun stuff. So, as you can see, kind of everything moves together, everything's kind of timed up. So, what we're going to do is we're going to make this a little bit simpler to look at. So, we're going to change the layout and we're going to go into what we're just kind of talking about with pressure. So if you look at this, it's set up exactly how you were standing on it here. So this is your right foot here. This is your left foot here. So what we kind of want to look at is how the weight, quote unquote, moves across your feet. But it's not technically your weight because we're not necessarily talking about the center of mass moving. We're actually talking about how the weight moves across your feet in 3 dimensions. So we have the thermography, which shows bright red where the most pressure is and cool blue where there's not much. And then we also have this dot right here in the middle. And that dot represents your center of pressure, not your center of mass. So when I reference this little dot moving, I don't always mean that the dot is you moving through time and space, meaning your body. What I'm referring to is actually the pressure moving across your feet. So let's take a look at this just so you kind of play along with me. So we can see here we've got our dot right in the middle, and this is right before you pull the trigger. So as you start moving, you can see, I'm sorry, before you start moving, you can see that your pressure kind of moves into your left foot. That is very, very common. That's called a trigger. And that's what Kyle Berkshire kind of does when he gets his rocking going back and forth. And you see a lot of the long drives guys doing. So if we're going to try to send it to the right, we got to start by getting it a little bit to the left. So there's our trigger. And here comes the backswing. Okay, so the club goes into motion. And we're seeing that you do have some moving towards the heel. So the center of pressure is moving towards your right heel. So we would call that a posterior movement. And we also see that you're getting 81% of the 100% available of pressure into your trail side. But when we look a little deeper, we also see that the thermography shows that your foot has kind of rolled more to the outside half and that you've got a lot of your pressure in your toes. So that's kind of interesting and something worth looking at a little bit later. So now going back to the number and 81% of your pressure into your trail side, when we think of a pressure shift, we typically need a reference. So if you were to think of a centered pressure shift, like a Tiger Woods or a Justin Rose, to where it's a very centered rotational golf swing, what we're going to see is that those players tend to be somewhere between 75 and 85% of their pressure into their trail side. With you, we can see you're at 81, which is kind of center of center. So you would definitely be what we would consider more of a centered style player. However, when we look at your pressure shift, we can see that it's moving quite a bit away from the middle and towards the right side, which would not be indicative of a centered post style player or somebody that has a very centered rotation. So, why could that be happening? Well, the early theory that I have right now, looking back into the thermography, is that we're moving out towards the toes, which is moving out towards the front half of the leg, which is for dynamics and explosive. But we're not really creating that full posterior movement into the trail heel and really getting that trail leg to load. to where we can push off of it later in the golf swing. So I think there's potentially some potential there to gain some distance and speed, but more importantly, some consistency. Because the issue may be that if we're getting our pressure moving too far off the ball, quote unquote, with a 7 iron, we're going to see that this ramps up with your driver. And when the pressure starts moving off the ball, there starts requiring some timing to kind of get back in front of the ball, right? So if you're supposed to be staying in the middle, but you're moving off the ball to the right, then that means that you're going to have to get yourself back into position. And that's what we're going to see next, which is where this pressure shift moves back to the left very early. So at this point in your golf swing, when you put 81% of your pressure into your trail side, we can see that the hands are only about hip high, which is actually not a bad position to be in. Now, I think there's some other things that are kind of attributing to some of this, but I like where the hands are relative to the hips when it comes to this maximum pressure back. But we can see that even though your hands are going back in this position, your pressure has started moving left early. So that's you trying to load into that lead side. And we see that that pressure gets all the way over to this point when you're almost at the top of your swing. So you are really twisting your body and creating some torque there, which is very nice. Now, the thing that makes you a great player, in my opinion, is that we now see that your center of pressure turns down towards that heel. So we're seeing that there is a big posterior movement in that lead side from you. Now, when we're in this position right here, we got some really good things happening because this is right about the position where we want to be taking advantage of that vertical force. So if we change the layout real quick, go back to where we were, we can see that we're spiking our vertical force right about this position here. And the reason that this is so advantageous because when you turn that pressure down, that means that your body stops moving left and your side to side or horizontal force kind of kills out. So what this means is that if your body stops moving towards the target and we know that the body has already twisted, the only thing left for you to do is to stand up. Now, think about this. When you stand up, you go into an extension phase in the lead side of your body, meaning that your body starts getting more rigid on the left side, and that's what stops you from moving left. Your body finally firms up. Well, when your body firms up, that's when we see the kick point activated within the shaft of the golf club. And that's what allows the club head to whip around here and create so much more club head speed versus hand speed. That's what accelerates the club head around the corner. So we can see that with your pressure shift, you do a nice job of creating that posterior movement and you create some nice vertical force here, creating 162% and vertical force. Now, when we compare that to the PGA Tour average, we can see that that's just about the PGA Tour average minus one standard deviation. So we're not doing so bad there. And I wouldn't always say that vertical force is better for every player, but I do think some more vertical force for you might be a good thing with your irons and helping you create a little better launch characteristics with the golf ball. So we can see that the torque is also fairly muted with your iron swing. And that's where I think that there might be some gains to be made because we see some kind of weird things going on up here in the horizontal that we'll talk about here in just a minute. But I think by getting a little more torque and vertical in your golf swing, you're going to be a lot happier golfer playing from that center post style position versus drifting back and then having to try to figure out the timing of when you have to throw the break. So let's dive into this just a little bit more. Once again, Neal, if you have any questions about any of this, please keep in mind that really all we're talking about is the pressure moving back and forth, front and back across your feet, right? So we're right now just talked about pressure and kind of how that's moving across your feet and how your body's trying to kind of hold you up. So now when we kind of look at this, I want to go back to that layout we had with the pressure because, like I said, when we look at some things here, when we get to this position with max pressure back, like we said, we're only getting 81%, and you're really not that wide with your stance width at 17.6. So we really don't have a super wide stance, which wouldn't lend itself or would lend itself to this going farther to the right. So that kind of takes that off the table. So my biggest concern is that I think the reason that this pressure is moving so far to the right is because right here we can see that we're getting out onto those toes. So let's go here and take a look at this real quick because I think this will really make it interesting for you. Get some of this stuff out of the way. We're talking about this position right here. And one thing that I want to show you is that when we talk about a couple things like your spine, I'm sorry, let me restart that. When we talk about your spine and how it works, I think this might be intriguing to you. So I've got a straight line, which is exactly not how your spine is, so don't really think your spine works that way. And then I've got a line here on your shoulder, and I want to show you something. As you take the club to that position, you can actually see that your spine angle really is remaining unchanged. Okay, it's more or less staying the same. So we're not standing up, we're not creating any kind of extension. And the thing is that we can see that the left shoulder has actually moved closer to the golf ball than when it started. Okay, it's actually moving towards the ball. So if we think about wanting to create space away from the golf ball and add length to a golf swing, we would actually want to allow for the spine to naturally extend as it's meant to do in the backswing. But what we see here is that you're actually staying in posture. And while the club head is being elevated, we're not rotating our sternum and our chest to elevate that golf club. We're actually using a lot of wrist angles to kind of force it up into the air. But when we do that, I think that's what's forcing you out towards your toes to kind of want to lift this, because we're going to see that the lift gets more exaggerated as we go. So we're never really creating any depth away from the ball. And when we think about depth, we really want to keep it pretty simple. We're only talking about how this or how these hands move towards and away from the golf ball, right? So when we talk about hand depth here, if I was to just draw a line, I'm gonna use a different color. I know it's not scarlet, sorry. But if we use a different color here so you can see it, your hands are really just kind of going up the line. We're not really getting those hands to move away. Sorry, lost my arrow there. Are not really moving that far away, and we're not really creating a round golf swing. And I think that that's why we see that we've got some muted vertical force, and I think that's why we see some really muted torque in this golf swing. Because what ends up happening, I'm going to throw the forces back up. I want to show you this with your side to side. We can see that that purple is really high right there. So you're pushing towards the target in this position. And we talked about that, right? It's because your pressure is going back left towards the target. So that all makes sense. But then it turns off and you create your torque, which is really, really good, right? So we can see that this stops, right? It turns off and goes down. Then comes the torque. So there's the first part of this is we want to go left first, then we want to twist, and lastly, we want to stand up. But we see that you turn the horizontal back on, right? So that's kind of different. You don't see a lot of players do that. And I think the reason that you're having to do that is because, like I said, we've moved too far off the ball and you've realized that, oh crap, if I actually twist and stand up from this position, I'm going to bottom out and lay sod. So I think that's why you have to turn the horizontal back on to try to protect yourself from hitting behind the ball. But then because we've had to turn the horizontal back on, this is where things get slightly messy in this position here. So we can see that the right elbow is tucked pretty substantially underneath the lead arm to achieve the position with the head relative to the hands that we desire. But I want to go back to the pressure and show this to you because this is where we could see some issues down the road with you. When we look at the pressure, watch what happens. So you can see that we haven't delivered the club just yet. This is when we want to be nice and firm through our lead side. And this is when we want to feel like the club head is releasing around the hands and going back around the arc, right? But look at what your pressure does. Your pressure actually moves way out to the outside of your left foot. So we're taking that left foot and kind of spinning it out like this, right? So where that could get a little bit messy is that if you don't hold that for long enough, what ends up happening is that really throws off impact for you, right? So when that just spins out like that, you really lose control because you don't have your left foot in the ground and now you're just kind of riding along for the ride. Now, why is it that that pressure blows through there? Okay, why does it do this? Why is it doing something that it wouldn't naturally do? Because normally we would just keep the pressure back in the heel and extend through the backside of our leg, which once again creates that extension and the stopping effect for the golf swing. Well, let's take a look at this in the video once again. So let's go back to our single. And we can see here that once again, that spine still looks pretty compressed, and the right elbow is underneath the left. So it's going to be very difficult for you to get out of that posture, which we can see, and that is why I think that we have some issues with the launch and why we're tipping your driver 2 inches right now, because we tend to get stuck behind and we tend to want to flip with that, right? And the issue with the flip is that for you, with the speed that you create, when you hit the low left, that's not playable. It doesn't work because we lower the spin rate so much that the thing kind of just hits the ground and runs and finds trouble left. So, where I think you would probably be a little more stuck with this pattern is I think you would probably find yourself hitting more blocks. And the reason that I say blocks is because you're a good player. And when I look at the right elbow being kind of tucked underneath the left elbow in that position, that's going to lend itself to a face being open. And it's also going to lend ourselves to having a steeper dynamic lie at impact than we probably should have or need. And what that tends to create is a lot of forward shaft lean. So I think that there's some things that we could do to clean up impact to where you wouldn't have to kind of work your equipment so far to one extreme, and we could create a little better launch by taking advantage of some vertical force. So let's see how this plays out with the driver. I'm sorry, I want to show you this driver. So this is the one where we put it in play. And like I said, I want to not go through this whole thing again, but I want to show you some very big similarities here. So even with your driver, okay, the pressure shift is still 80%. So people are very consistent onto themselves, even though it's a driver, even though it's a bigger swing, all those things they tell you, you can see that you're still moving the exact same way that you did with your iron in terms of your pressure shift here. So I wanted you to see that. I also wanted you to see that you are out on your toes even more with the driver. And that is because it's longer and it creates more centrifugal force going back and kind of wants to pull you off the ball. So I want you to see that that is just a slightly bigger version of what we're doing with our iron. So it's very, very consistent. The second thing I wanted to show you is that when we look at the driver, because we're swinging it so much faster, you do an amazing job once again of getting the pressure to the left. But this doesn't look like it got nearly as far to the left this time as it did with the iron, if you remember. So we can see that once again, we have a very similar pattern with our force production to where we turn on the horizontal, trying to get back in front of the golf ball, which you're doing. But then we can see that this time it stalls a little early, okay? And once again, turns on the torque, right? But then we know we're going to drop kick because you haven't even started down yet because this is your driver. So you turn it back on to get back in front of the ball. And then here comes the vertical. And you can see that you do a much better job getting your vertical up here. But I would argue that when we look at the position of your body right now, I want you to see something. So you create this vertical, but the club head is still way behind your body. I think that we're not really timing this vertical up very well. And I think that has to do with this horizontal force production. But when you don't time that up very well, look at this pressure. Oh boy. So it's actually moving into the trail side after impact. So we can see we're really getting a lot of side bend, right side bend here after impact. And that puts a lot of stress in that lead hip, lead lat. And if it doesn't hurt there, or it used to hurt there and doesn't anymore, it may have already moved into shoulder, elbow, or wrist. And the thing that's very concerning is that when you are in this very defenseless position and you are in range of motion, you can see your left side's about as tall as you can make it. We're starting to see you turn the vertical force back on a little bit here. And we call that a double peak. And that beginning of that double peak can really lead to some inflammation and soreness. And when you're trying to get your card and keep your card, we don't want you sore because we want you playing at a high level. So this double peak is literally a production of that pressure escaping through to that left side, which means that your body keeps wanting to go left and you're having to kind of use the physical body to throw the brake and lean back. And once again, I think that's why we get that right elbow tucked underneath the left, why we tend to have the face open and the handle up, and why we're constantly trying to keep this thing from being the big flare right or that god awful snap hook left, which doesn't happen very often, but is in the repertoire from time to time. So hopefully this kind of explains a little bit of why you do what you do. And I think that there's some things we could do trying to help you create a little better vertical force production, a little better torque, and kind of clean up some of this horizontal. And I think overall, it's very simple concept to kind of change. But once again, I want you to always make your decisions for yourself. So I've kind of shown you what I see and some of the things that I would like to explore and work on. I think the reason behind working on those things is pretty simple. One, I think, is safety and health. I'm a little concerned with this slight double peak that's starting to develop because at the speed you create, we can start to really create some stress on that lead side, which causes pain. And when we look at how you create your speed and your braking, we can see that you're creating way more with your lead side than your trail. So once again, when we think about how much you create out of your back foot, you're creating 10% out of the horizontal force. But then, I'm sorry, you're taking 10% of your available horizontal force and pushing it towards the target, but then you're pushing back with your lead side 14. So we can see that the lead side is really overworking here. And I think that by getting the right side to load a little bit better and by creating a little more load into that right heel, which creates a little more posterior move, what we're going to be able to see is that we can clean up everything we've talked about, keep you happy, healthy, safe, and also create some better launch conditions with your driver and irons that might make the equipment situation a little bit easier on you as well. So if you have any questions about this, as always, please reach out. My email is Michael at measuredgolf.com. I would give you my cell phone, but I don't want to put that out there, and I'll send it to you. But yeah, reach out. Let me know what you got. If you're interested in going about making some change and wanting to talk about how we would go about implementing some of this, I'm more than happy to have another conversation with you at a later date about that. But once again, I didn't want to put anything in your head. I just wanted to kind of give you my feedback as you requested. So hopefully this is helpful. And until next time, keep grinding.